Today we'll be discussing the do's and don'ts of network density. So we've put together a pretty outstanding panel, if I do say so myself. So before we get started, I'll give some tips here. So if you all want to join in the chat and ask any questions, I'll be managing throughout and poking and prodding Chris to make sure to throw some of those in and try to read some of your thoughts as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Chris and let him intro our panelists today.
Thanks, Jacob, and I will do my best to make sure I'm on the lookout for any questions that come in. So you may have to prod me a few times as I get older and my attention span's limited. But yeah, thanks, Jacob, for the intro there. And yeah, awesome panel today. And thanks for everybody for joining. Thank you, Jacob, for man behind the scenes, and we discussed a little off camera, for always making these come together. And again, I really appreciate the guests and everyone else joining in today. So yeah, got a panel discussion today. We're going to talk about some do's and don'ts of network density. So I guess I'm going to, want to let everybody on the panel here introduce themselves. So I'm going to go in no particular order, just on how my screen goes. Why don't we, in addition to introducing yourself, maybe also give a little brief spill on how you guys define network discipline and what it means to your organization, in addition to your just basic intro. So I guess, Mr. Cole, I'll start with you first.
All right. Thanks, Chris. So I'm Cole Stevens, the Chief Strategy Officer for our family business, Stevens Trucking, based here out of Oklahoma City, to kind of dive into how we continue to try to keep, a very, tight lane network flowing with our fleet. I would definitely say that diversification is super important in terms of your customer base and the discipline that comes along with looking at various sectors economically to try to keep your freight flows working in tandem with each other, but also obviously geographically. We try to stay, super lane dense within our segment so that, it can keep some different costs in check whenever your people are used to operating in, certain geographic areas. So, geography for one, but then diversification of your customer portfolio, I think super important within your network.
Well said. Chris Henry, I know you're going to have probably a slightly different perspective in how you answer this question, but go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about maybe KSMTA there. I know you're joining us from London, Ontario, up in Canada. So again, appreciate you being here.
Yeah, no, glad to be here. Honored to be here. So yeah, my name is Chris Henry. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of KSM Transport Advisors. So we're also referred to as KSMTA, so you can use that term. But we're the transportation consulting arm of KSM Business Services, which is a 700-person strong tax audit consulting firm based in Indianapolis. So we're the small piece of the puzzle there, but we work with over 50 trucking companies directly. Our tax and audit partners and group, they work with over 200 trucking companies throughout North America. So strong focus on transportation, but for us, our practice, it's entirely truckload, entirely over the road. So this topic is near and dear to our heart. We use a model called Freight Math, which is a time-weighted margin-based network profitability tool. So our core mantra, which lines up with this presentation, is density drives efficiency, efficiency drives velocity, and velocity will ultimately drive profitability. And that's a universal truth that applies to pretty much any business, but in trucking, especially in this market, it's one that should be imprinted on your company's walls and repeated. But network discipline is something that we focus on in good and bad markets. And I have a lot to talk about here, so you might have to shut up a couple times, but this is near and dear to our hearts.
Well, I appreciate that. And last but certainly not least is when he's not running marathons or training for them, he does tend to play in the trucking space. So Lars Ward, for those that may not know you, the few people out there.
Hey everybody, my name is Lars Ward. I'm the VP of Sales and Strategic Partnerships at Chima Freight Lines. Chris, I'm going to steal your line on velocity. That might be one of the best lines on how to think about networks. But when you think Chima, you're probably going to think of us as a historically I-5 corridor carrier. But we are in growth mode. So we have 500 trucks supporting the West Coast and Texas. And the way I think about network discipline, very simply would be, it is the thing that we go out and sell to our customers. It is the thing that we go out and sell to our drivers. Now, that's simply said. All the complexities are everything else we're going to get into. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank all you guys. Got a lot of questions to go through. Don't know if we'll get through all of them, but we're going to give it a shot. So I kind of, have some just loose thoughts, again, relative to the do's and don'ts in terms of the discipline. So I think you guys both, all of you touched on it to some extent, but just to kind of reiterate some of the, we're talking to broader fleets that may be tuning in today. How do you maintain that network discipline and just kind of avoid that overextension when you talk about geographic footprint? And, to add to that, can we make an assumption that by maintaining that discipline, it will lead to improving efficiency and profitability? And I guess, Cole, because we'll just keep going down this line until I change it up. But again, as I've said earlier, please feel free to chime in. I want everybody to have their own perspective to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that, kind of to Chris's point, having that density is where everything starts for us, quite frankly. And when you talk about the discipline of building that network and maintaining it, it really just has to be a corporate effort, top to bottom, right? With, where you're going to be doing your pricing modeling, everybody understanding, that if you don't typically go to Chicago, then you shouldn't be pricing freight to Chicago. And that's got to be top to bottom, right? Because your people that could be doing spot market freight or anything, they start funneling, parts of your fleet and your entire network into areas that it's not meant to be funneled into, and you can find yourself overextended, very quickly. So really, if people are going to take like the discipline of whether it's a loose market or a tight market with capacity, it just has to be at the top of your mind all the time to, in my opinion, stick to what you're good at. And that's kind of how, we try to run our entire network. Is if we don't go out to California, where Lars and them are operating with Chima, like, why do we need to go out west and try to do something completely new and kind of reinvent the wheel per se for ourselves, right? Because typically there's already providers in those spaces that are already creating that lane density within their network. So like, it's going to be it's going to be even harder to compete in a market like right now if we don't already have a stronghold. Because to Chris's point, when it comes to buying fuel and all these things, there's so much efficiency that can create the velocity when your drivers know where to park, when they know where to fuel, all these different types of things. So a new geographic area is really tough to try to extend into. So you got to keep your core pretty tight.
Yeah. Awesome. I love the way you phrase that up. And I want to Chris, I'm going to come back to you, Chris Henry, but Lars, because you guys are both in the asset trucking world, and Cole kind of mentioned how you guys are predominantly a lot of West Coast based. Any other thoughts to add on that, on how maybe Chima approaches it? Maybe similar, maybe a few differences there?
I'd say in general, we're approaching it very similarly, right? Network discipline, there's this healthy tension between your operations and business development, but I would argue it's a business development problem. A lot of carriers are out there chasing. They're chasing business and they're chasing rates. And when you're doing that, you're chasing a network that is just fundamentally undisciplined, right? And so I think the problem is pretty clear. You go and find individual segments of business that are profitable, and when you put the sum of the pieces together, the machine doesn't work and your OR is crap, right? And so I think in order to solve the business development problem, you solve the operational sort of execution, right? Where you say, this is what we do, and then the magic is because you answer that well. So we run these lanes because we know where our drivers live, we know how to park, we know how to fuel, and hey, I shut down here because I deliver here and I pick up there and I come back this way, right? And so in order to solve the business development problem, you got to solve the operations problem. I'm not trying to say that it's easier to gloss over the complexities that go into it, but if you don't have a disciplined network, you probably have a very bad business development approach.
Yeah, thanks for tying the BD aspect, and I think that sometimes gets overlooked. And Chris, I want to hear, obviously you're going to take a slightly different vantage point on how you answer this question, but as someone who's consulting a lot of organizations, how do you address this in this type of conversations?
Yeah, we have the unique perspective of being able to observe where, we're not on the playing field like Cole and Lars, but we get to see, what do the top performers do, and then incorporate what the best practices are into, the rest of our client base. But I think, there's a couple other points relative to, what's driving network discipline or who's responsible, more importantly, for network discipline. And, it's operations. It's always, thought about as an operations problem or issue. Pricing, definitely sales. But, we're finding, maintenance related issues that are byproducts of undisciplined networks. Recruiting is a major one. So as the last 2 years have unfolded, the strategy for a lot of carriers out there have been to change from making payments instead of making profits, which mean you're going to locations you're not used to going. And as a result, that becomes a de facto recruiting map for your team. So it becomes an easy button. So a good analogy, and a lot of carriers can appreciate this because it comes up every time we talk to a prospective customer, is, they have no business, good business going in and out of Texas, for example, but they have, 40% of their drivers hired out of Texas. So
Right.
the whole idea of it's just an operations issue is something that I want to kind of dispel, because it just amplifies as you get more undisciplined. The other thing that I'll mention, and I won't belabor this, is you need to the frontline people, make sure they understand the why. So it's one thing to say, we're not going to Nashville, or we're not going to the Tennessee, greater metropolitan area, or Tennessee or Nashville metro area. But it's another thing to say why. And so what we've done with our clients is made that a visual reference. So make them understand the volume of freight in and out of a particular area, and then the corresponding profitability. So being able to easily show them in a visual why that is. And we can do the same thing with lanes. So that's something that any carrier that spends enough time, even with some Excel knowledge, can do, and really drive home the importance of staying within, your own lane, and staying disciplined.
No pun intended. Yeah. And what's interesting is that it's no secret the market's not in obviously the most favorable conditions as we've seen. I think I'm not going to belabor that discussion by any means. But again, for Lars, and maybe I'll turn to Cole first, though. In a down market, you're always looking for some form of growth, or at least you want to streamline and make your operational teams as much efficient as they can be. But going back to that, how do you reconcile when you have a sales front that's like, hey, but Cole, we got all this opportunity in a different geographic region. It may be out of our footprint traditionally, but we've got to. How are we not looking at a growth opportunity? Can we? And I think Chris Henry just kind of touched on that. But does the sales team start getting a little angst of like, what do you want me to do if we've tapped out in the markets we're good in, and you're preventing us from going out and exploring other, again, revenue stream opportunities? How do you discuss that with those team members?
I think it's a balancing act, but it's also driven by that pricing side of the sales, because, if there's enough margin, in it, kind of like Lars alluded to, for the profitability sake, and you can analyze that out and say, okay, this is worth a little bit of the risk to take this out there. Like what percentage of our entire network could be affected by a decision like this? And typically, if it's a small enough percentage, then you can maybe take that chance, because like Lars was saying, they're in a growth pattern too with Chima. So like, in order to grow, more than likely, they're going to have some new areas, right? And in a soft market, to your point, Chris, we've gone through that too, where maybe you've lost a little bit of work here, a little bit of work there, but then a new opportunity presents itself for the same customer going into a different area. I think that's where you got to be lockstep between your sales and your pricing and your operations team, with not overextending. Again, kind of back to that word, it's like, if I've never done anything to the state of Washington, you got to go through, more times than not, the state of Oregon. So if your safety DOT team doesn't know that you need these permits, you can find yourself in a world of hurt if you didn't price it correctly and accordingly, and you don't know those nuances because you don't operate there. Or you can try to deliver something to Long Island, or something that's not getting cross-docked to go into the 5 boroughs because they don't allow over a certain length, right? Those are nuances that if you don't operate there consistently enough, you can find yourself in a world of hurt in pricing, and possibly ruin a relationship with an existing customer trying to do something that you're not very good at, right? Or you just don't know. So there's a lot more to it than just, I'm going from A to B and I give you my line haul plus fuel price, right? There's way more that goes into analyzing the network and staying sound, regardless of good market or bad on pricing. And I'm a big fan of looking at the percentage growth of like, okay, keep it under 5% if we're going to go into a new geographic area to kind of test the waters and see how that goes long term, versus this new customer is going to send us out here 50 times a week. Let's just try it. Right. That's
Right.
I've never seen that go well.
Well, and I don't doubt your experience, generational experience with the Stevens family has probably learned that lesson a few times. And hopefully, Cole, it sounds like you're very wise in how you've come into your role now and making sure that point is constantly reiterated.
Dad made the mistake before, and so have I. And we've both learned firsthand that, it's best to stick to what you're good at. You can try it.
Yeah.
You can try it a little bit for a really, really good customer that you have a great relationship with, if it's worth it to them and they're going to pay you and you have a good communication line that this is the expectation. But more times than not, when you try to do something crazy, you try to cross border something in Mexico, if you're not used to doing that, it becomes a heavy lift for your entire team and it can hurt.
Yeah. Lars, I know that you and I have gone back quite a bit, and I know you're now in the asset world. So a bit of an adjustment. I think you still wear a biz dev kind of commercial facing hat a lot of the time. So I know this has probably been a lot. This will be very good it's good for my learnings, but I would imagine you're going to get a lot of takeaways from, the guys like Cole that have been in the trenches for a while. So what's it been like for you? Because you're kind of, it's like the inverse scenario. You're out there trying to grow the business for Harmon and the team.
Right.
And have you learned a lot? Have you gone down these paths yet and had some kind of gotten bit, so to speak, or have you just adhered to that? And I want to hear your thoughts, because you're kind of you're relatively new at Chima. So what's that been like? How are you dealing with that?
Yeah. So there's a lot there, right? So I've worn the asset hat before, the brokerage hat, the hybrid hat. So we've got the hybrid right now. The lion's share of what we do is running 500 truck fleet, right? And Cole, I was smiling when you said you don't want to take a load into the boroughs, because I remember it was a brokerage load, but the first time that I accepted a bunch of freight going out to Long Island, and the customer even called me.
Great
and said,
margins.
Are you sure? Yeah, right. I know, but
why?
And you get the education real quick, and so it's funny. Some of these experiences can only happen after you've learned the lesson, right? And then you get really good if you learn it from others. But Chris, even going back a little bit, the original question talking about why we're going out, why we're trying to sell, why we're trying to grow. Think about the nature of growth in trucking in general. Change is so inherent to our business, because you don't sell it and then forget it. When you win it is when you start, right? And then putting all the pieces together and having that figure out some sort of harmony that actually makes sense, delivers to the customer what they expected, and is profitable to the business, is where all the hard work is, right? And so when it comes to the asset business here, what I would tell you is we saw a lot of change in our bid season. We won with a lot of customers. We won a lot of new lanes with some customers. And we also have a certain segmentation of our fleet that we're testing out some new markets. We had planted a flag in Texas last year, and last week we started a new lane to support San Antonio. It's not a market we've supported before. And so now we're started playing the game of, well, how do we figure out the pieces to get back into our network, do it consistently, do it profitably, and keep our drivers happy, right? Mm-hmm. And so what I'd say is, part of it is there's a really fun game we're playing, because we are in that growth mode, which means that we have to step out of our comfort zone, right? But with that, we are still committing to the same discipline we have everywhere else in our business, saying, well, for all these things to be true, we have to do this, this, and this. And then we also have to be willing to accept some level of risk, right? It doesn't work out perfectly, but it's kind of an interesting problem. When you get to an established, sort of fleet size and you want to maintain it, that's one element of it. But for the smaller truckers who are trying to grow, and for truckers who are just trying to increase in their geography or their fleet count, there's this, sort of huge problem in figuring out that new business. And I guess the best part of it is we get a very immediate feedback loop. We get the feedback loop in pricing from customers very quickly. We get the feedback in service very quickly. So I don't know. I know I'm kind of bouncing around there a little bit, but the point is we're
no, it's good. I appreciate it.
And these are marbles, and they're scattered all around, right? And so I think the challenge is having the operational guts to stand in the middle and say, this is how we're going to figure it out, and this is how we're going to run it, right?
I love that. I like that you're still already bringing that collaborative nature. And so for Chris, I would, again, as probably a pretty, I'm sure data means a lot to you, and KPIs and metrics, et cetera, all absolutely important, and having empirical evidence to kind of back these things up. But when you're going into these organizations that you're working with, when you're trying to align the sales and the pricing teams and operations, do you have any best practice to share? And, how can they leverage those KPIs to making sure that the commonality and that North Star, that drive across all functional teams is being maintained?
Yeah, I think, a starting point with every new client is most carriers we start with are using about 80% nuance and a little bit of science. We're trying to flip that and use 80% math and science, and leave that nuance and that practicality to them to build relationships, those kind of things. But in order to do what we do, we have to bring in the element of time to the mix, and so that's a different concept that most carriers are used to. So looking at their margin from both a time perspective, so margin per day, margin per hour, but also looking at from a network perspective, when you connect, how you're doing going into an origin area, and then how you're doing going out of the destination, and in between that one-way movement, how that comes together, that is a different thing. So we're kind of selfish in the fact that our North Star are our key KPIs, and those are margin-based metrics that we drive home, and they become the North Stars for our clients. So we're kind of, biased in that regard. We try to have our clients ignore the ego metrics, the ones that really don't add value. So, tractor count and, miles per truck per week. Obviously, you need to know productivity wise, drivers are putting in the miles, but really get down to focusing on the margin and adding that velocity with time is a key part to what we do. And then we also do density metrics as well. So looking at, how many areas you're servicing and the volume of freight in and out of those areas are key. So being able to understand, for business development, strategically and surgically, where we need freight, where we have too much freight. And, one thing that I'll mention down maybe later in the conversation is the importance of the non-asset side. So if you want to weather the storm and all of these roller coasters, you need to have a high performing non-asset business to leverage the good stuff that you're doing on the asset side.
Yeah. Do you find, do you get a lot of folks that, may be a little enlightened when the data points that you provide, that they may, the gut instinct, the intuition, a lot of folks kind of live and die by that. When you quantify that for them and have some real data to back it up, do you find that they're often, their judgment may have been a little off to some extent?
Yeah, there's always skeptics in the room, especially when we're talking about our model. Once they see the data, once we show them how they can back into it, because it's not a black box. You can work the math backwards to say why this load, had low margin per day. So we typically win them over pretty quickly. And the strong operators, typically the owner operator, or connected to that operator, they're intuitive. They've lived and breathed the business. They can understand, what things are likely going to fall out as bad, what we call toxic, and which ones are going to be really good, what we call franchise. But there's always some surprises in that vein.
Yeah. I kind of want to shift over, Cole. I know you and I both have a fondness and wear a lot of strategy hats these days. So we talk about like strategic diversification as a category. Yeah. There's a lot of notion out there that says, for risk reward again, do we want to be, and market conditions come into this, you lose a big customer and start to question, are we overly dense in one lane? Should we have diversified? And maybe based on freight profiles, freight types, the lanes, you could say that, is there a pro and con to trying to not really, you want stability. Mm-hmm. And while the simplification is probably going to be required to get back on track, do you see diversification versus simplification at a network strategy wide level? How do you kind of approach that? Because it's a double-edged sword, like I said. Yeah. Again, how do you balance that within Stephens?
By trying to talk to our people too, right? About, because you can be over diversified as well to where it's detrimental to your business, quite frankly. I'm all for strategic, smart diversification so that we're not, overextended with one customer to where they have just full buying power over our fleet. But also too, you can really over diversify and really ruin a relationship with another small customer or another potential customer that could have grown to be a large customer. because you're trying to over diversify, right? And if you only get one load a week with a fleet our size, it's hard to get the attention necessary from the operations team on that potential one load when you're doing 100 loads a week for another customer, right? And so there's this really fine line of like making sure you get enough within a specific area, but then not making sure on the flip side of that coin that you're not taking way too much and overextending yourself with that customer to where they have full pricing power over you, right? And so, you know, it's kind of the 80-20 rule, right? You don't want to be on the 10% fringe on this side, and you don't want to be on the 10% fringe that side, too big or too small for what your core KPIs should be telling you. And that's kind of how we try to, that's how we try to operate. You know, we would rather turn down a really, really small award that we think we could fail on, even if it could help diversify us more, than to potentially fail on that customer because they're not getting the attention that they deserve from an ops team. That it gets way harder when it's only such a small scale and too diversified. So it's a fine balancing act. You just got to try to, again, stick to what you're good at and what you know as a core part of your business.
Yeah, I think that's great. Lars, I'd love to, I mean, again, I want to hear your take over at Chima. Is that similarly how you guys view things when it comes to, going with what you're good at versus having some element of diversification to make sure that there's as Cole said, it is a balancing act. So how do you guys approach it at Chima?
No, Cole's on the money there, right? There's maybe this that I would add to the conversation about diversity. If you're like most carriers, you probably have some established business, right? Established carriers, established lanes. And so as you think about this process and you go through the exercise, take a step back and attempt to define what diversity among your customer base, among your freight mix would actually mean. And I think what you want to do is you want to avoid sort of the single point of failures within a market. If this one customer shuts down a plant for a week, 2 weeks, are we toast? All right, well, that's a problem. So how do we move away from that? And the other part is, how do you create the optionality to grow and to have opportunities? And so, Cole, the idea of bringing on customers, but doing so in a smart and strategic way, 100% agree. If I'm going to go and accept one load a week, I've probably jeopardized the opportunity to grow with that customer over some period of time by being willing to jump in and say yes to the wrong piece of business. Now, it doesn't work with every customer. We know that the business cycle is pretty tough here. But having sort of the fortitude to say, hey, look, like for us to really jump in and be meaningful to one another, we've got to find a little bit more to say yes to. Let's get the contract done. Let's be able to conduct business and keep the conversation going. But let's pick and choose the moment and the spot and do something that's going to be sort of a win-win. And think about it from a shipper side. Like, you want to give them all the credit in the world. They saw something that said, hey, we want to work with you. All right, let's take that energy and find a better application, right? Going and onboarding a new partner is not an easy process. For us as the provider, might be even harder for most shippers, right? So I think the idea of diversity, there's the conversation about how carriers think about diversity, and there's a conversation about how shippers think about diversity. And I think taking that message and saying, well, here's why you should put me in your network. I don't know if I'll be the cheapest or who you're going to kick out to fit me in, but here's the reason I think I deserve a spot, and here's the reason I'd love for you to have a spot in my network. If you come to the table like that, I think the diversity conversation makes a lot more sense. The goal, the end goal, is a robust network that can weather the ups and downs, the seasonality, industry spikes, all of it. That's what you need at the end of the day.
Yeah, well said, Lars. Chris, I was kind of thinking about, I wanted to introduce one other variable that, obviously we're in this trying to make a few bucks, and it's a razor thin margin on even in a fairly good market for the most time. When you talk about the profitability aspect of freight and you're trying to figure out which freight you take, what you don't, you got to be thinking about, I want to maintain a profitability. That's a no-brainer, but I also got to, again, balance that with how efficient my network's running. So I don't know if you have an example of where maybe you've advised the company on that, and they're kind of in this predicament of, I want to make that right decision, and what should I be considering about for both the short term and the long term for network balance?
Yeah, so I think the starting point is you have to understand the ins and the outs of the network. It can't just be focused on the one-way profitability. So it's one thing to say, okay, it's a great rate, and that lane we've done before, but if you don't have corresponding direct freight on either end, then the chances in this market of making any profit are slim to none. So if you have broker to shipper to broker, that's probably a losing variable right now. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it too is because when we look at pricing for our clients and RFPs, again, we're looking at how that load would likely perform on its own, including an assumption on deadhead, but also how you're performing going in historically to that origin, how you're performing going out of the destination. So there's many times, even in this market, where we can say definitively, you can actually gain market share and make out like a bandit by actually going lower than, the incumbents and the target. So this is a time a lot of smart carriers are taking that approach right now, gain market share, accept tenders, get the freight, because they know when the market turns, they're going to have the ability to lever up those rates a bit. And going back to my point about non-asset side, we're big fans of network sprawl on the non-asset side. It doesn't exist. So if you do a good job on the asset side, just like you can lever up a trucking operation, that's the whole reason why, trucking is attractive to a lot of companies and entrepreneurs, is you can use leverage. You can leverage good performance and those shippers allow you to broker freight. You can make out really well and weather these storms. And instead of this roller coaster of profitability, you can see more of a straight line throughout most market cycles. So again, that's an important part to consider from this perspective.
Yeah, again, it's a very service driven business. So Cole, for you guys, I kind of want to stay on that. How do you feel like in a lot of instances that you see opportunities where you have serviced various customers and it met or exceeded their expectations in terms of service? Obviously, pricing has to be competitive. Are they coming to you now and saying, hey, if you guys want to just, we need some assets, of course, but if you guys think that there's other opportunity, going back to Chris Henry's point, are you leveraging more logistics or brokerage type opportunities to see how you can, you're kind of reducing the risk because it's in an open market, right? Are you guys seeing is that something you're seeing at Stevens?
Absolutely. That was a big initiative that we've had over the past couple of years. I would say right now in a softer market, people are less open to having those conversations because they've been pretty, sound on their book so far. But I think as the market starts to tighten, that's when you just have to know your business model enough to know the timing of when you should have those conversations, right? And we're starting to honestly see some things within, the entire country that there's some service failures starting to go on.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get into the bullish versus bearish and all the data and KPIs that sometimes you see in our industry on LinkedIn or something getting, slung at each other. But I will say that there are some rumblings of some service failures where maybe what took some freight away from someone else was overextending their network. And now that shipper is now seeing, right, that come to fruition, that it was more of a paper rate per se. It really wasn't a reality for a serviceable rate. And so, with that, it just seems like there's some various tightening things going on that, like, I was just meeting with our sales team earlier about, hey, it might be time to start presenting the brokerage arm a little bit more, right? Because we may be able to do some of those power only options with all of our trailers. And really it's timing of having those conversations, but then it's the willingness with your shipper partners to see that, hey, I've got a creative solution for you and that I can actually do it. Because you can make anything up that you want, Chris, and it all sounds great until the rubber actually meets the road. No pun intended at all, because you have to execute for these shippers and receivers, with just the culture of what society expects now. I mean, it's kind of the Amazon effect, right? Like, I want my things when I want them, and I want them right now, and I want them 98% of the time on time, right? And so if you're going to jump out there with your sales team and you're going to make that promise, then you better operationally be prepared on the back end to execute, because that might be your one shot at it,
Absolutely. Lars, I know you have background in a prior life within brokerage and in this movement of trailer pools and power only type networks. What's been the response so far? And again, Cole really eloquently stated how the things to consider. But when you're in your role
Yeah.
now, are you seeing a push towards more of an appetite for your happy customers to start exploring other avenues outside of just the assets Chima runs into brokerage or even into the trailer pool type model? Or are you seeing that there's too much risk in their view from a shipper and service failure concerns that they're a little more apprehensive right now anyway to explore those opportunities?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. And Chris Henry, I loved your point on, the asset carrier building out the brokerage, right, just to help weather any market from a financial viability standpoint. I think that is so important, and it's something that's been critical for us here at Chima. I think, like a lot of folks, we're fighting for profit, and our brokerage is certainly helping us, to be a strong financially, positioned sort of organization. So I would say, hey, we're seeing that, we see the value in that, and I think the marketplace sees the value in that. I guess I'd say this, from a shipper standpoint, they're going out and they're procuring transportation, right? And they're probably going to have some category of their business that makes sense for their asset partners, and they're going to have some category of the business that makes sense for their brokerage partners. And here's the argument I would make. If at the end of the day we're providing a service, right? As the trucker, I'm bringing you the truck that brings you the service. And as the broker, I'm bringing you people that bring you the service. Those people are everyone in the brokerage organization and the partner carriers, typically small truckers who get the job done. Now, they're different core competencies, but if I'm going to be your asset partner, I think we should have a seat at the table for your brokerage allocation. I don't know what that piece looks like, and we've got to earn it just like any other market participant would earn it. We're going to earn it with competitive pricing, good service, and hopefully, if you're doing the job the right way, there are folks on the other side of this table that want to work with you, right? And so, hey, it's a challenging market. There has been an explosion in brokerages over the last 10 years, and we're seeing that peel back a little bit in recent years, right? Most brokerages haven't done a good job of differentiating themselves and being able to clearly articulate, hey, here's what we do, right? And so I think the, one size fits all, live brokerage approach, we do a little bit of everything. Yeah, there's probably not a place in the market for those folks to thrive. But if you're an asset trucker and you've got this healthy brokerage, you service the heck out of your freight, and you've got some clear value points where you're like, hey, here's the things I do really well. I'm going to figure out how to do trucks with you, but let me figure out how to do brokerage. And it's not this sort of like just over the wall approach. Like you really can compete in both and stay on your own 2 feet. I don't know, but I think everyone should have confidence going in and telling their shippers, like, this is exactly what we want to see at the table. It's what we're doing. And I'll tell you, even in a tough market, it is working, right? Now, the challenge is shippers, they get a little bit of leverage, right? They're going to hold you accountable on doing a great job with your trucks to give you that opportunity. But I think that's a fair price to pay, right?
Yeah.
Because if I do a great job for you, give me this opportunity.
Right. I think you made a good point. I see so many brokers out there that are struggling to answer that question that we've all encountered of how are you different than the last broker that came in here? So I think that I'm so, back in my early days at a CH, right, where that was one of the only games in town relative to the time. And now it's great to see the asset community. And this is not a new concept by any means, but the idea, and I've been a shipper too, right? I always felt like I slept better knowing that there was I could call the asset provider directly and get what I wanted. I think, Lars, you make a great point. If you've earned the business on the asset side, I would absolutely be open to saying, hey, I want to help you guys out. We're partners. So any of those opportunities like you alluded to, let me allow you to extend a bit into the logistics and the brokerage side of what your capabilities are, knowing that you have assets to subsidize that in the event that something goes wrong versus being at the mercy of the open market, hopefully, to recover something and prevent a service failure. So that's just something I always, every company I work with, that you're starting to see, probably due to the low barrier of entry, that brokerage mindset really taking shape with a lot of even really large asset companies, because if they've earned the trust and the credibility with their shippers, I think that the trust is there. And I think that's the end of the day. It goes back to, if I enjoy working with Cole and Lars and Chris, I'm way more likely to kind of start thinking differently in how I can help them, grow their own business. It wouldn't be a conversation if we didn't mention data. So, Chris, I think you're going to be the guinea pig on this one. But when you talk about, the data utilization, and we're kind of talking about high density lanes and a lot. How do you, whether this is something, an active process you're engaging with your clients today or things you've just witnessed over the years, when you talk about utilizing data and analytics to to prioritize those high density lanes or the profitability that comes within those dense lanes in the network, what are the metrics they should be focusing on in particular?
Yeah, so we have something that really any carrier can do on their own that I think would be a good takeaway, and that is identifying what we call power lanes and spider lanes. So if you have a way to export a group of orders, origin, destination, and you also have a defined market area, so you can use DAT or you can ask us, we have a free one that we can give you. You can then create these common pairs of origin destination lanes. And a typical scenario is 5 to 10% of freight are going on one or two lanes in most networks. So those would be what we consider power lanes. And then the least dense lanes, basically the bottom 25% of freight, could be going on 100 or 200 different unique lanes in a given 4 or 12-week period. So you can easily, in a span of 2 hours, quickly identify your spider and power lanes by doing that. And then there is a very strong probability and correlation to density and profitability. So the spider lanes are likely scenarios where you have broker to broker to broker to shipper trips. And then the power lanes, you have 90% shipper. So we can say with a lot of certainty that those spider lanes are the ones you're going to have to cut out. So in this market, what we're focusing on is cutting out the worst of the worst, because uneducated consultant in trucking would just say, hey, go get more of this really high paying stuff. Well, you would if you could. So what we're trying to do is limit further margin erosion. So focusing on those bad areas and those bad lanes, and those bad lanes are typically low density, is a good first step to get things right. And the kind of the elephant in the room for a lot of carriers right now is there's not profit. Most carriers are likely in the red right now and have been for 6 months or longer. So there's a discussion about keeping the tractors moving to keep that revenue flowing in, so payments could be kept up and bills can be paid, those kind of things. So, it's too easy to just say cut your capacity when that happens. So it's a multifaceted approach, looking at what is the trade-off if we set these tractors against the fence and cut out these lanes. Can we gain some additional margin? And that is a potential option there. So,
Cole, I was going to ask you, have you guys, and I want to bring up one other point, Cole, and just the frequency of doing these analytical exercises. I think when markets are favorable, everyone's making cash hand over fist. You just tend to think the roller coaster is never going to end. We've seen this time and time again. Yeah. It is a cycle, and inevitably the cliff you will hit it. Yep. So going back to hit Chris's point, Cole, are you guys in that? Do you guys come in those situations like, well, is it more economically to park the truck, or do you just, because it's CapEx, because at the end of the day it's on your books, do you find it's more feasible to take the losses or break even, or do you often find yourself, hey, based on the maintenance costs and just all the other line items and overhead, et cetera, do you guys tend to take some time? There may be scenarios where you're like, hey, let's just kind of reduce our fleet size, whether it be temporarily or permanently. And again, so that's a two-part question, but I want to kind of hear your feedback on that, because you're right there in that seat.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, I'll give you the runaround answer, Chris. I think it really depends upon like the customer and how your core of your operation works, right? Like, so if we lost, maybe a 10 truck mill or something due to pricing and we had to go pick up other work, I think that's easier to probably park the trucks. If it's some dedicated model that, really you're just kind of doing in and outs on a short haul basis or something like that. But you got to remember, with one-way transportation, typically there's a customer on the other side that you're trying to match up with that quote unquote one way. And so that's where it gets really tough when you're doing your analytics of like, do you slow down into that area, or do you just keep pushing through at a possible lesser rate on the spot market because that's a core customer of yours, right? And honestly, like, that happens during a tight market too, when pricing's great, because opportunities come and go. I mean, a plant can shut down right, that's no fault of yours, and a customer pull out of a geographic area, right, for whatever reason. I mean, I've been here for 9 years. My father's been at it for 45, and there's probably been one a year that even affects us, of, someone shutting down somewhere in Alabama or in Oklahoma, where most of our business is out of. And so when that opportunity goes away, you have to be doing your analysis to see, like, do we keep running those trucks? Where's the market at? Because the market could be great when that occurs, right?
Right.
And then that gives you an opportunity to fill it with something else. But we do our analysis, as we were joking before we started, a lot of the time at the Thanksgiving dinner table or just the regular dinner table. So at our business, we're very fortunate to, have those conversations very, very often, right? Between sales, operations, on the biz dev side, whatever, with like, do you park some trucks here and there? Quite frankly, to be transparent, we've never really operated that way. My father takes a lot of pride in the fact that we are mostly company operators and drivers. So, it's our duty, right, during the really good times to put back for whenever things get tough on pricing, because these people have trusted us with their job and their livelihood, right? And they stuck with us through a global pandemic, and serviced freight for people. So, like, it's our duty to figure it out on the back end whenever the market's super soft for an extended amount of time. And we buckle down, we run super hard, we make sure, to Chris Henry's point, that we're doing our analysis on those core lanes and keeping that density, going. And so, yeah, I'd say customer specific, but also really doesn't matter the market, because I've seen it on both sides.
Yeah, I think you make some good points. I mean, there is a domino effect, right? When it's, one of a plant or a manufacturing facility, whatever that may be, goes down, how it really has that ripple effect within the carrier community that's kind of relying on that to kind of connect the dots for their network. So I also love your point, Cole, as always, that driver-centric approach of they've been over backwards for us, and whether it's good times or bad times, we owe it to them. It's our duty, as you said. I that really hits me hard, man. I love it. Lars, similar question to you. Is Chima kind of on a regular basis, some form of cadence, having these discussions on, hey, whether it's week to week or it's quarterly, who knows, to each organization, you make the call. How are you, in addition to what Cole had added, anything else that Chima's doing right now to make sure that we're staying ahead of this and doing a routine analysis on these things, especially, maybe even preemptively before these unfortunate events can unfold?
Right. Yeah. And hey, Cole, I just got to give you kudos the way you're thinking about it and the way your family is approaching the business. I'm not a part of the Chima family, but what I would tell you is Harmon, our CEO, takes a very similar approach, right? This idea of, when you have a predominantly company driver fleet, you take care of them in the good and the bad times, right? We would all agree that this is a pretty crummy time in trucking from a rate environment standpoint, especially as fixed costs have gone up considerably over the last few years. And so, right, the variable cost and what we see in the marketplace, like, yeah, it's always up and down, and it's down quite a bit from the recent highs, but it's just tough. A lot of folks are running break even, and that's not a place we want to live. So, Chris, on the big idea of how do you make decisions whether or not to sit trucks, every carrier is going to approach this a little bit differently. We're fortunate here at Chima. I've been here since the beginning of the year, and we have more of our trucks are seated than when I started. We didn't bring in more trucks. We've just been doing a good job of hiring and bringing in great drivers. They want to stay around with us, and we've found the freight to keep them busy, right? I think when most fleet park trucks, there's something else that's going on. Sure, they could probably go and get those seated, and it would be a little suboptimal. But usually it's more of a market condition than a strategy, right? To say, hey, we just don't have enough ROI to go and run those miles. It's more of like, hey, like, we are struggling to find the business that's profitable. And so because of that, we're making that decision. And back to the big question on the data, it's interesting. So often I think we spend time reviewing the data from the pricing opportunities we have and trying to figure out the heads and tails of, like, all right, can we make this work? And at what price can we make it work? But I think the bigger game to play is looking at the network of the real data that's happening in your business every single day, right? And then reviewing it and saying, well, what's working well? How do we make sure we defend the heck out of this by doing a great job, right? And then what's not working so well? And then the first question should be, if it's not working, what are we not doing right? And if we're doing everything right, but for some reason, whether it's the mix of other customer business or the operations that we didn't understand before we jumped in, if it's not working, how do you go and either figure out a way to fix it or figure out a way to exit, right? And I think that piece, that's where a lot of carriers need to do the hard work, because it's sort of that 80-20 rule, right? Like, gosh, if you can figure out a way to sort of refresh that bottom 20 and continue to improve your network, it solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, well said. I mean, this is great. I love hearing it from practitioners in those seats today. As we kind of approach the top of the hour here, I wanted to kind of get more high level, kind of have some little fun here. No right or wrong answers, but when you talk about I don't want to have the crystal ball question for you guys, but relative to some of these do's and don'ts and network density, any whether it's a prediction or advice or anything that would be of relevance. And Chris, I'll start with you. When we talk about just how companies need to better adapt, and we talk about it's a people business, but there's also process, technology. I think those three are all equally important to some extent. How do you kind of prepare these organizations, Chris, you interact with, to be able to have that level of adaptation and resiliency, to be able to weather the storms, and and again when times are good too. So, I'm going to open that to all of you, but Chris, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think a key part of that puzzle is a centralized pricing model. So you can't, in our opinion, have sales and pricing intermingled. Hopefully, I'm not offending anyone, but it's kind of like that accounting model. You need to have a distinct person, and it's not just someone that's really good at Excel, someone that can kind of understand the qualitative aspects. So my analogy is someone like an actuary in the insurance world. They can take the risks, the probabilities, the sales conversations with agents, and basically construct a rate that makes sense for the business with input from all parties. So being able to have that role defined, and then secondly, be able to respond rapidly, because the trend that everyone is observing is rates, requests, and events are going to happen more frequently, and being able to adapt and respond accurately and profitably and rapidly are really good things to have in your inventory for sure.
Yeah, Cole, I'll let you chime in on the same question. Just no right or wrong answer.
Yeah, I agree with Chris too. Something that just kind of struck a chord with me, Chris Henry, was something you talked about earlier was time, right? And so whenever people do their pricing and analysis, they have to look at how long that paper and that contract's going to last, right? And if they can pallet that for that amount of time, if it is a longer cycle, or if they think they're going to get a better opportunity if it's just a 3-month cycle on that, on that RFP and on that quote, right? I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people don't take into consideration as much as really trust your forecast, trust that data, whenever it comes to that, whenever you are doing your pricing model, because if you're expecting some market to turn, maybe in the first part of 2025, then why would you maybe lock in at that long-term cheaper rate now versus you might be able to lock in for a cheaper rate for the next 3 months if you think it's going to be soft. I mean, it's all up to your internal forecast and also kind of like the reality that you're living in that moment, because there's some fleets that are super busy and there's some that are not, right? And some people really need the work just to get the cash flow back up, and then others are kind of getting so busy, to Lars's point, more seated drivers than they had at the start of the year. So their capacity internally is starting to crunch, right? Even if you don't think that capacity is tightening market wide, maybe it's internal to your company. So you got to keep that strategy, in my opinion, at the core part of your business. Is what's the reality that we're living right now? Back to the conversation we're having, operations, sales, and pricing. And I agree with Chris wholeheartedly. You have to keep sales and pricing. You can't put that all under one blanket to where a salesperson can control going out and getting an unprofitable load, because maybe that gets them a commission or something, and keeps them busy and makes the top line revenue look great when it's not driving a core to the business, right?
It amazes me how the disconnect between sales, pricing, and operations tends to be. And that's asset brokerage, shippers. I've worn all those hats, I think, at some point, and I'm always baffled when they get in a room and everyone has a diametrically opposed objective before they leave that room. and yet they missed the whole point of the collaboration is to try to streamline that as best as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Lars, I know you've worn a lot of hats and been on the tech side as well. So, I think all this is probably I'd love to hear your response to this same question, just based on, again, your background.
This question we could probably wrap on for an hour, right? Like opining on where the market's going to go and the trends that we're excited, because this it's such a big part of the game, right? And so I think in line with our conversation, one of the trends that I've been watching for, Cole, goes along to what you were saying, is how shippers are looking at some shorter terms for pricing. And I think the idea is to be close and true to the market, but a part of it is sort of, the ever constant pressure of commoditizing the trucking service, right? Mm-hmm. You move it from A to B, and there should be a rate for that. And you look at the LTL world, and are we ever going to see tariffs for full truckload, where this zip to this zip should cost X, right? But the reason we haven't seen that is because the freight characteristics, the complexity of the market, and the service expectations of different shippers are all over the place. So shippers sort of create their own market through their RFPs and the relationships they build, right? But I think as this pressure continues to, only increase over time, and we get better data on both sides, shippers have better data on the market and on utilization and how pricing should work, and carriers get better data on what's fair in the market and how their utilization and how their OR is actually responding, right? I think the way we fight it off is by building these disciplined networks so that we can, even if things are commoditizing, and say, hey, I do this really well, and this is why you should work with me, right? And hopefully when we do that, we get to avoid the ups and downs and don't get commoditized and say, hey, just put everything to the spot board, API everything, and hope that it works out. Well, I don't think any of us want that. We want to be able to build these networks and take care of drivers in ways that get the job done, right? So the only way I think we can do that, and that's the trend that we're trying to fight, is truckers have to have better networks. Full stop.
Yeah. Well said, Lars. I'm going to be refrain from mention the tariff word with any full truckload conversation. Man, I think that can open up another.
Yeah.
But again, there's you go back to these. There's a lot of discussion around just the RFP process, procurement. Is the future still? You could argue either way, right? It is, should we go in? If I always use the analogy, if I buy a plane ticket, right? It's always a market price. And I think in trucking, we've been so accustomed to the RFP process and locking in rates. All this kind of ties into building out density and just strategy of how you're going, and it often determines the next 12 months in many cases. And I think you are, at least for the shippers I engage with, are starting to look at, hey, if it's a static lane, high volume, we got good providers, it ain't broke, right? And there's buying power associated with that. But for all that other overflow, spot type freight, I do think there may be more frequency, these mini bids or more frequent procurement events. So I think that would be a great discussion for another day. But well, guys, like I said, I appreciate all the inputs today. I'll leave it with you guys, each of you individually, to give any parting thoughts. There's a sustainability thing. We kind of touched on it, I guess, inadvertently on some of these. We haven't overtly stated how do you make this sustainable. We talk about network density, so maybe that's a good I'll let you guys each have the last word from your own perspective around how do we make this sustainable in terms of building out the density. And we talked about the do's and don'ts. So Cole, I'll let you you're next to me on the grid here. Any advice for those listening in that are still struggling with this? Any parting thoughts you'd say? If there's one thing you take away today from Cole Stevens, it is, Cole, what do you have to say?
I think that you have to keep the network density as a core part of your value between your mission statement for exactly how you're going to attack the truckload space, if that's what you're operating in, and stick to it regardless. Up, down, left, right, sideways, circles. The market's going to do what it's going to do, but you just have to play your game and stick to a really healthy network density. And in order to do that, in my opinion, it has to be at the forefront of every person's mind, because we still, as much data and amazing technology as there is out there, this is still a human-driven business. And it's got to be on the top of everyone's mind that this is exactly what we're doing and why. To Chris and Lars' point earlier, you have to communicate that to your people. And so I would just say, if it's not something that you're executing on today, you got to make that a part of your core business unit and make it very, transparent with how you're going to communicate that to your people. Right.
Well said. And again, knowing you come from a generational background of trucking experts of sorts, then I think that should hit home for those listening in. Chris Henry, I know you're, thank you. Chris, I want to kind of leave it for you. Again, you have a slightly different vantage point in this discussion, but what are some parting thoughts for those listening in they have taken a lot from this conversation and they're going, well, now what do I do? So what is your words of wisdom?
Lots of different low-tech ways with Excel to understand where that density or lack of density lies from a lane basis, from a area basis. So we have some articles online you can refer to on go to freightmath.com and go to thought leadership. So that's one thing. Doubling down on what some of our clients call computer work. So bad data in, bad data out. So companies working with Optum, I think you can attest to this. If you have bad data, you get bad predictions. So doubling down on quality control on data, and that includes timestamp data. So really focusing on that, using auto arrive and depart so that you have good quality data that you can then optimize with your own tools or third-party tools. And then the last point is, brokers serve a purpose to the industry. They allow carriers to leverage them to connect one good area to another, but they don't serve 30% of your purposes. Right. So need to get, a real focus on what percent of your freight is being driven by brokers. And if it's, upwards of 30, 40%, you need to get a direct connection with some shippers and, prepare for thriving times in the future.
Well said. I think freight math, something I'm going to walk away with. I think that sounds like a fun major for someone like me. So freight math. Okay. Lars, we'll go ahead and wrap it up with you, man. Any parting thoughts for those folks listening in?
Freight math is such a better term than, sales math, which I say a lot, or trucker math, which is when I'm doing this and trying to figure things out. What a fun conversation. I mean, truly, it's fun to talk about networks at a high level. And what I'd say is the truth is it's very hard to get these things right. I think we put a lot of time into it. I think it's the right way to spend our time. This is where I think all of the sort of ground is gained in this business, right? And it keeps us coming back every day. But maybe just as a parting thought, I would leave a stat that Inbound Logistics put out in their survey last month, and they said that 81% of shippers value service over price, and it's at least what they said, right? I know we're all rolling our eyes, but I think the point is, as long as you're competitive, if you're in that competitive hunt, shippers will pay for the service. Mm-hmm. And when we put the service together, when we put the network together, that's where all the value is. And I think that's the key, the heart of the conversation. And that's why we all get to wake up every day and try to compete in this business. And, the entire conversation on building networks, this has been a lot of fun, and just appreciate being part of it.
Yeah. Well, guys, as always, it flies by. So I want to go ahead and thank each of you for joining. I did not give everybody a chance to how do you contact, but I think everybody's name's on the screen. I think every one of you guys I've seen on LinkedIn. You have your own company web pages, et cetera. So folks that are listening in, please reach out to these are experts in this topic, and I highly encourage everyone to take full advantage of being able to have this discussion and continue even further. So with that, appreciate everybody joining today, and wishing everybody a great afternoon, and we'll be back on the air at some point in the near future. Thanks, everyone.